Hey everybody, it's Beej with Lambda School. Today we're going to be talking about a fairly reasonably simple topic, MIME types, and how it relates to web browsing. So the objective today is to understand what MIME types are, how to recognize them, and how you determine them from a file name. So we'll talk a little bit about the history of that, how it's useful, and then we're going to step into how we can determine the MIME type for a file that we have. So a bit of history. MIME stands for Multi-Purpose Internet Mail Extension. If you ask most people, they probably won't remember that. That's okay. Everybody just knows the word MIME. Now originally this was for mail, as you might imagine from the expanded acronym. Back in the olden days, email was just text. That's all. And you couldn't do things like send hilarious animated GIFs of kittens to your friends because that wasn't plain text. So somebody decided what we really need to do is be able to embed other kinds of data within our emails, such as images or anything actually. And so they wrote this general purpose definition for MIME that allowed email users to embed all kinds of information in their email, which was great. One of the things that you had to embed in there was the type of information that you were passing. Is this plain text? Is this an image? Is this an audio file? You had to pass that type information along with it so that the email reader would know how to decode the information that had arrived. And that's a very similar problem to what the World Wide Web has. We have a lot of different kinds of data that get passed around the web. Sometimes it's HTML, sometimes it's JavaScript, sometimes it's CSS, sometimes it's images of kittens. But what we really need to be able to do is attach a type to that data so that the web browser knows how to display it. So the basic problem is that web data is just a stream of bytes, and bytes are just numbers. So a whole pile of numbers arrives at a web browser from a web server. And that web browser wants to know how it's going to interpret that data. Because all data just looks the same. It's all a big pile of numbers. So how do we know this big pile of numbers is HTML data? Or how do we know if it's GIF data, for instance? So when the server sends a response back to a web browser or to any client, it sends a header. It sends some additional information along with the data that was requested. We call this the HTTP header. And within the HTTP header, we have a field called content type. And that identifies what kind of data accompanies this. So in this example, the response would contain a stream of bytes that was actually markdown text. And then the web browser can decide what to do with that text. There are all kinds of MIME types. Other ones that might be more familiar to web developers are text HTML. It has the MIME type for HTML data, or image/JPEG for JPEG data. So how does the server actually determine what the MIME type is for a particular file that was requested by a browser? So what happens is the server looks at the file's extension, that is everything after the last period in the file name, and it uses that to determine what type the file is. Is it a JPEG or what? And from that, we can do a simple mapping to a MIME type. And then once that's done, we can include that in our content type field in the response. So for example, if we have a file that we're requesting from a server, images/goats.jpg, because goats are awesome, the server will look at the file extension, .jpg, determine that's a JPEG file, and so therefore the MIME type for this must be image JPEG. And so the content type header gets set in the response to image JPEG, and then the goats.jpg data is sent back as a raw stream of bytes to be interpreted by the web browser. These are just a few of the MIME types. Here are some common ones that a web developer would see frequently: HTML and JavaScript and CSS and a bunch of images and JSON data, type application/JSON, text data, markdown data, and so on. There are hundreds of MIME types defined. Some of them are official, some of them are unofficial, but you can always find a MIME type for just about any kind of data out there if you Google for it. So how does the browser use this data once it arrives. So the browser will get a response from the server, and the server will say, hey, I've got some data here of type image/JPEG, and here it all is. Now most browsers know how to decode JPEG images. So the browser would get that image and say, okay, I'm going to show this to the user because I'm good that way. More commonly, the browser might get HTML data. And of course, the browser is exceptionally good at showing HTML data, so it shows that. But what if the browser gets something it doesn't recognize? What if it just gets some raw data or a data file that has a MIME type it doesn't know? It has a few options. One of them is it can just download the data. And a few of you have probably experienced this, where you click on a link expecting to see something show up in your browser, but then it just downloads a pile of raw data instead. And you have to launch some third-party tool to view that data because your browser didn't know how to show it. If the browser is aware of a third-party external viewer, it can launch that as well, and that sometimes happens. So this has all been about data that we get from a file. We request a file, and the server determines the MIME type from the file extension and sends that information back. But what if we're not getting a file? What if we are generating the data programmatically? So we've hit an endpoint on the server that we've written. That doesn't actually go get a file anywhere. It just generates some data and then returns that data, or it performs some action and returns a result. How do we get the MIME type for that? Well, we have to look at the response that we're sending back, that we're generating, determine what type of data that is, look up the MIME type for that data, and return it. So for instance, maybe somebody hits an endpoint that asks for a database request to be performed, and we've decided that we're going to return some JSON data as a response. And here our JSON data here is status success. Everything's gone well. Because this is JSON data, we're going to set the content type to application JSON. And that way, the receiver, the client, can know exactly what to do with this response. Note that it needs this information because it can't figure out on its own if this is JSON or not. There's not enough information in the data. For example, this could be plain text for all it knows because it's just a sequence of ASCII characters. In many ways, plain text looks just like JSON data. But here we've been more specific and we've said, hey, this is actually JSON data. It's not plain text data, and you can treat it as such. So for a bit of a challenge, take a look at these challenge questions. Go ahead and pause the video here if you want, and go and look around and learn a little bit more about how MIME types work. As always, thanks for watching.